6 FortiGates and then maybe one at a head office somewhere, you really could just do it from the FortiGate. You'd have to log into each box and make some changes. We do have a full REST API. There are all sorts of CLI scripting you can do. You can do tickle scripts or TCL, tool command language. There's a lot of things you can do with Python, Ansible, etc. But if you're just, the average user programmer, you're not a DevOps person, you can actually log in and just use the GUI, and you can do pretty much everything. Now, everything's available in the CLI. There's almost full feature parity with the GUI. Some of the GUI articles are kind of suppressed by default, and you can change that. There's a feature visibility option. You can go in. We try to make it as easy and uncluttered as possible. Again, I've worked other places where you log into the GUI, and again, it's very intimidating if you don't understand what you're doing. So today, we're going to look at the FortiGate GUI first. We're going to talk about enabling the SD-WAN interface, configuring the routes and security policies, looking at those SLAs that we talked about earlier. We're going to configure some SD-WAN rules, and then we're going to look at the usage monitoring. And again, this is all stuff you're going to do hands-on in the lab. So I apologize that the slide is very wordy. These slides were actually designed by our training branch for use for our partners initially. Now, that's a great thing because this was meant to be a learning tool for them. But the importance of doing this on a webinar, I don't expect you to read every slide. We're going to give you a copy of this afterwards. You're going to get a copy of the broadcast. You're also going to get a copy of the slide deck, as well as any question and answers that are coming through. So don't feel like you have to screen scrape any of this stuff. If you're using Snagit, that type of stuff, you don't need to do that. You will get a copy of everything. But if you focus your attention to the right side of the screen, the picture, you'll see at the very top, the SD-WAN interface by default is actually disabled. You have to enable it. And then you can add members. You'll notice that at the top, you'll see HQVPN1, and there's a little red tunnel beside it. That is actually a tunnel interface. It's an overlay or VPN. You'll see that the gateway is specified. So that will supersede anything that might be in the routing table. You could leave quad 0 there and just use the routing table, but again, that's up to you. Now, we've added a cost box. This is really interesting because it's one of the SLAs that has changed, since version 6.0 moving into 6.2. And, you can basically assign costs to these, and you can change them whenever you want. But that's another way to control where traffic's going to go. And I'll talk about that with an example when we get to the interface, when we break down the SLAs. You'll notice that this was also added. This is very handy. If you've used Fortinet before, you're probably familiar with the IPsec VPN wizard. Makes it really easy to set something up if you've never built a tunnel before, because it'll create, not only will it create the interface, it'll create the security policies for you, it'll create the default routes for you, do the black hole, etc. It creates all these different references inside the environment. So if you've never done it, it guides you through it. You're great. The problem is that when you go to add, you'll see HQVPN1's already listed. If you tried to click that in the drop-down box, you'll notice maybe there was HQVPN2 as an example. You'll notice when we click the interface to say, where is it? You'll notice it doesn't show anything beyond port 5. There's no other VPN there. If an interface, regardless if it's physical or if it's one of the tunnel interfaces, if it is mentioned anywhere in the policy, so in the routing table, security policies, etc., it won't be here. So if you use the IPsec VPN wizard from before, you have to go and remove references in those spaces before it'll show up here. So we've decided to add a one-click VPN where you can basically click on the plus VPN, and it's a separate wizard that only generates what's needed for the SD-WAN. Can be modified. You can change it. It is possible to use the other wizard, but again, if you're a first-time user, don't recommend doing it. And this is something you're going to do in the labs. So remember, if you're using this inside the labs, you're going to click the plus VPN button and you'll be good. When you look at the SD-WAN usage towards the bottom, there's bandwidth, volume, and sessions available, and that's just a graphical interface. You'll notice that right now that the arrows are pointing down to show that the traffic is, the tunnels are down and nothing's passing, but that's just obviously an example. You'll see that they're up today when you're building things as you add things to the interface. And, it's a great way to quickly check to see what's going on in your environment. Now, the wizard itself, you'll notice in the bottom right corner, there's a great picture of what's going to happen. There's a couple steps when you go in to create it. You'll be able to set the IP addresses, the outgoing interfaces, etc. If you're using pre-shared keys, you put them in. etc. But it's meant to simplify VPN creation for the SD-WAN. Now, everything is done through the underlays. And so if you hear us talk about overlays, we're talking about virtualized tunnel interfaces. If you hear us talking about underlay, that's the physical interface. That's that WAN 1 or WAN 2 that you're used to. And again, this is meant so that you could create the VPN on the fly without having to even go back to the other wizard and then remove things. Because, I mean, you could use the custom option in the other wizard and you could still do the same thing, but you're clicking in and out. It's just not, the experience is not as positive. So forward error correction, we've talked about this a couple times. Now, the important thing to note is that we can enable this per interface on an ingress or egress basis. So what we're doing is it's dynamic remediation of packet loss, because if you're sending something across and you're having packet loss on the line, you're asking, the other side ends up asking for TCP retransmits, and it can really, again, slow things down, and it could cause problems inside your actual tunnel. So forward error correction will actually send the extra information, and then it's rebuilt at the other side. So if there is packet loss, it looks at the parity information, and think of it like a RAID. You know, when a drive fails, the parity information that's being stored, you know, or striped, depending on how you're doing things, across the other drives, you can basically hot swap a drive that failed, put in a brand new drive, and the RAID will rebuild itself. It's a similar feature, because what we're doing here is we're taking that extra packet stream, and we're saying, okay, we're going to rebuild these ones that obviously I didn't get. So without having to ask for TCP retransmits, we can rebuild at the other side. From my perspective, one thing that's important to note is that for this to work, it has to be Fortinet at both ends. Now, of course, IPsec is a standard. If you had Fortinet at one side and Cisco at the other, or Fortinet at one side and say Checkpoint at another, that's okay. They'll talk to each other, but you couldn't do forward error correction because the other device isn't speaking our language, if you know what I mean. When it comes to this type of stuff, this is more proprietary. So just be aware that the functions there, I believe it made a huge difference on quality of experience, especially for things like voice or video. But you know, this is something you may want to look into depending on what version you're running. Now, the virtual interface itself is very handy, because you'll notice the top screenshot shows port 1 and port 2 available, both physical interfaces. Now the SD-WAN virtual interface is what you'll see when you go to edit a static route, or you try to put an IPv4 policy in. You'll see that how it's mentioned as a device or the outgoing interface in each of the other cases here. You don't need to worry about setting up, port 3 going to WAN 1 or port 3 going to WAN 2. Now you can just say SD-WAN. It'll be there. It'll be easy for you, and everything will work. Dynamic routing. So this is, again, refers to 6.2. This is one of those features that from a support perspective, there's no GUI reference for this. This is one of the things that has to be done in the CLI. So if you're using route tags and things like that, being able to go in and use that BGP information from dynamic routing, you can do it. Again, like I told you, everything's possible on the CLI. There just wasn't a GUI version of this for 6.2. We're looking to build more out, and some things you'll see in 6.4 will be changing, and I think you'll see, again, some further improvements. Okay, so looking at the performance SLAs, you're going to see things like the link health monitor, SLA targets, and link status. At the very top, you'll see that this is Google Ping. It's called Google Ping, rather, and it's pointing to Google's, one of their public DNS. 8.8.8.8. Using ping, it's saying I'm going to do this across port 1. The enable probe packets is something it's pretty much always on. The only time we'd ever turn that off is if it was related to troubleshooting. You'd be told to do that. The SLA targets, you can go in and define them yourself. There are some recommended values, but again, you'll notice in the screenshot it says 5% packet loss. That's pretty high, but just know that you can control this yourself. You can add multiples, whatever you want to do. The link status at the bottom is something that we would use to prevent flapping, and I'll go over that in a few minutes. So looking at this here, you'll notice that ping and HTTP are available in the GUI. Again, in the CLI, we've also got TCP echo, UDP echo, and TWAMP, or two-way active measurement protocol. So if that's something that interests you, again, you can go in and change that very quickly. It's just, we found that our experience with customers between ping and HTTP, depending, as long as you're hitting the right resource, i.e. what server you put in there, In this particular example, there's 2, and you'll see it's for the data center PBX, obviously internal for this particular company. The one thing that's important to note is when you see 2 servers listed here instead of just 1, you'll notice that there's 218.32 and 218.5. Both of them have to fail the SLA before there'd be marked as a problem. So when you're looking at these, as long as one's working, things are still okay. Now, participants, you'll see WAN 1 and WAN 2. Usually when there's a participant, you'll just basically get to define which links, because sometimes you're going to want to use the physical underlays, sometimes you're going to want to use virtual overlays, sometimes you're going to want to use both. And that's something that we'll look at with a couple different use cases. Now, this is one of the things from a quality of life perspective. I love this when we added this part. You'll notice, and if you're colorblind, you won't see the blue and the yellow. But if I can just tell you that if you hover over anything on those lines, you'll get a graphical representation of what, in this case, you'll see latencies highlighted at the top. So right where the new explosion is, that's a bar that represents the last 10 minutes, and it does update in real time. So it basically scrolls back and forth, et cetera. If you've been part of any of my demos over the past few weeks, you'll see that I use this quite often. There's a dotted gray line that actually represents the metric. So in this case, it's latency, and that's the threshold that we defined in the SLA itself. Towards the bottom of the screen, that information is static. And what I mean by that is when you first click on Performance SLA, this information will populate. That graph at the top is constantly moving, but the information at the bottom is kind of a snapshot in time. So if you know that there's a problem and you want to see, hey, is that 100.45 milliseconds going up or down? All you'd have to do is left click on the Performance SLA section on the left, and it would give you another idea of where you're at. You can see very quickly that in bright red font that there is a problem. And again, graphically at the top, this would say, this would likely lead you to go look at the logs or whatnot, because then you can start to say, yes, there's definitely an issue. Now, again, you'll have multiple SLAs when you create things. You'd have to just click on each one, and each one will give you the information you need. You can also edit them on the fly, which is really nice. So if you see something, we were doing some testing the other day in the lab, and we were testing for jitter with some voice calls, and we were just trying to lower the threshold because we were trying to force a failover from one to the other to test something. This is where you could do that. So it's very, very handy. Now, we talked about the SLAs before. Again, having the ability to go in and, define these things yourself. Again, latency, jitter, and packet loss are the 3 things you can do. You don't have to do them all. Maybe jitter is not important to you as an example. You just care about latency and packet loss. It's totally up to you, but you can control that. The important part to note about the bottom, again, is about link flapping. So the check interval is fairly self-explanatory, i.e. how often do we check the link? You'll see every 500 seconds. Now, it has to be 5 failures in this case before it's marked inactive and as failing the SLA. But the important part is restore link after, in my opinion, because it's one thing to have a link go down. It's something else completely to say, okay, when do we want to bring that link back into play? When do we want to use that? And if it's the preferred interface, things may switch back. So we want to make sure that it's not too fast. So if it's failed 5 times in a row, we want it to succeed 5 times in a row before it's marked good again. Now, one thing I will mention, we talked about this very briefly, but the recommended values, if you're not sure, I always recommend, if you're using a cloud-hosted voice over IP service, let's say RingCentral, talk to RingCentral. They will tell you what you need to have for quality of service to ensure that, that the call is going to be good. You don't want to necessarily try to guess this stuff. We're trying to buffer that to make it a little bit easier for you. We can make some suggestions, but again, always talk to the vendor you're using. In my opinion, you're going to get the most current and up-to-date information. Now, again, if you're looking at Amazon Web Services, a lot of this stuff, we deal with this. We work with them quite often. So it really depends from an engineering perspective, what you're trying to do, what the application is, et cetera. Again, treat this as a guideline, but we put it in there to make sure that it's something you can have so you're not wondering. Because I've done that before where you use a product and you're like, well, what am I supposed to use? I don't know. I've never done this before. Let's talk about the SD-WAN rules. So the interesting thing is you can still name them. You'll see source and destination, very much like a firewall rule. But now we can say, okay, the source address, in our case, it's all. There's no user groups to find. But again, you can add that granularity if you like. But the destination, this is So you can still use a destination address. You can still use protocol numbers. You can go in and specify this stuff if you want, but you can also start to use some of the information that we've built up on the back end. So things like the Internet Service Database or ISDB objects that we talked about earlier. Why do you want to remember where Office 365 is being hosted and Microsoft's 41,000 IP ranges or whatever? It's insane how many IP ranges they have. So imagine how many IP addresses you'd have to try to maintain. We have special agreements with these big companies to try to make this easier for you. We want to know that you can go in and say, I'm going to use Office 365. You don't have to worry about it, because again, you have to start to look at geolocation and what's lowest latency for you. If you had an IP that was, say, in Europe, well, that doesn't help you here in Canada or the US necessarily. We want to have something in North America. And even that, let's look at East or West Coast or Central. Let's try to make it better for you. And that's why they have so many. But you can do that. And you can also look at things like applications. So we talked about Ring Central as an example. If you wanted to make a rule specifically for Ring Central, you could actually go in and do that, which does make it easier.
Yeah, go ahead.
1 second. Somebody is not muted. Okay, I apologize for that. Sorry, one of the panelists had to take a call and must have hit their unmute button by accident. But again, getting back to this, so you can look at some of these things, choose your application, choose your internet service, or specify the address. Like now, the outgoing interfaces, this is where you start to decide what is best for your needs, and you look at the different interface preferences. Something we've changed, we've added a couple, and we've changed a couple. So let's talk about those. So when we look at manual, this is interesting because in 6.2, we've added this feature, and really what you're doing is you're pinning traffic to an interface. Now, you might say, well, what traffic would I pin? Is it good, bad, best, indifferent? What does it matter? It matters because now you can say that really important traffic, as an example, your voice traffic. We want to pin that to that MPLS link because we pay for that quality of service. That's considered critical to our business operations. I want that to always go there. I don't care if we have an internet link through Rogers and we're going to use broadband internet. I don't want my voice traffic to go over there. You can do that. Conversely, you can also say, I'm going to take my low importance traffic, the lower priority stuff. And you could say, well, the guest Wi-Fi, I don't ever want it to go across my MPLS and get backhauled out the internet. I want that to be pinned directly to that Rogers connection. And if it goes down, I don't care. So you can decide how you want that to happen. Just remember, you can pin traffic to one interface. It could be critical or it could be non-critical. It's up to you. Now, best quality, this is where you start to take multiple interfaces, and you'll notice that there's an interface preference. So it could actually read WAN 2 at the top and WAN 1 at the bottom. Whatever one you add first appears at the top, and that is considered your priority interface, the one that you're going to use the most. However, if you want to change this on the fly, you can go back in and edit this. It's not something that's set in stone. You build it once and then you're toast. You can decide how you want this to work. You pick your SLA, and then you pick the criteria you want to measure against. In this case, you'll see latency is highlighted. But we also added another piece on the side that you'll see that custom profile, and you think, what does that mean? Well, you can go in and actually decide, I want to weight these myself. So if this is based on what you want to do in your business, you can decide what the link quality criteria is according to what is important to your business, depending on what you're trying to do. And you'll see that there's an algorithm at the bottom there. It's very basic, but it just shows you. You don't have to memorize this, but it just shows you that there is a calculation that's going on behind the scenes. Now, I talked about lowest cost earlier. Remember when we were creating the interface, there was an option to go in and actually set up the cost itself. This is where you can start to specify. We used to call it minimum quality, but we renamed it in 6.2 to lowest cost. And everything that matches that rule will go to that particular interface. Now, again, you have a preference. So if, as an example, the lowest cost, maybe VPN 1 and 2 are both 0 by default, it would use VPN 1. If for some reason one of them, say VPN 2, or even better, VPN 1 is preferred interface, and for whatever reason it wasn't meeting the SLA, HQ VPN 2 would take over seamlessly. So again, just as that extra layer of control, you can kind of steer traffic based on the cost. Maximize bandwidth. This will do a round robin, and it'll basically load balance sessions across the participating members that you choose according to the interface preference. Now, looking at the rules themselves, we talked about the internet service objects being able to go in. I did forget to mention the application groups, because you're not going to make a rule for every single application. You might, make a group called approved business apps or something like that. And you go in, set them all up, and you could set that group in there as well. So that's something that's going to make your life a little bit easier. Now, again, SD-WAN rules are treated as policy-based routes. So you have to, when you go in to look at the routing monitor, you just go over and take a look at the, the policy at the top. You'll see it's highlighted in red. That's where you'll see a lot of this information going routing perspective. And again, if you put things into the gateways and whatnot, that will supersede what you see on the routing table. So this is why when you're steering traffic and you're forcing it to go out certain links, this is how some of the magic works. Firewall rules, top, bottom, first match, pretty common for all of us. SD-WAN rules are similar. So you'll see that it is top down, first match, just like you would see in an explicit firewall rule. The difference is that the implicit rule at the bottom, and you'll get to see this in your labs, it will route traffic regardless. And this is why it's so critical to have your security combined with your application information. So let's take a look at the implicit rules. By default, actually, source IP is the chosen algorithm, but you can also do source destination IP. You can do spillover. Spillover is essentially, I always use the analogy of describing a glass of water under a tap. You let the water fill up to the point where you don't want to use it anymore. You move the glass aside, and the next glass takes over. Obviously, if you run out of glasses, well, that's the bandwidth limitation for your entire link. You're saturated regardless of whether you had one or more. It can only go so far. Sessions and volume, you can kind of weight these interfaces for ingress and egress to determine how much you want things to happen. And again, that's either by session count or by bandwidth volumetrically. That's the difference there. But so the bottom line is, if you don't explicitly define something in an SD-WAN rule at the bottom, it's going to hit the implicit rule and it's going to be routed accordingly. Now, that being said, there has to be a valid route. And again, it'll default to what your security policy allows. So in that instance where you were pinning traffic manually, as an example, guest Wi-Fi out your broadband link, you would put a rule in your security policy that says it is only allowed to go out that interface. So that if it ever, let's say because the load balancing on the back end of the SD-WAN would say, okay, well, Rogers is down, so we're going to load balance based on the implicit rule. Theoretically, it could go out the wrong interface, and you don't want that to happen. So you can actually stop it with the security policy. Now, IPv6, if you're doing it, some of this stuff is, there's partial display in the GUI, but obviously full configuration is done in the CLI. I still don't see a lot of customers using full IPv6. We definitely have some. If you're doing this, I'd be really curious to hear in the comments. But just know that IPsec support is available. Talked about status monitoring. Again, what use is a security tool or even a routing steering tool that you have no idea what's going on? So there's tons of logging, tons of events. You can log in, look at the performance SLAs, what's showing, is there a problem? I showed you that graph before, but even the system events, like knowing when a static route's being changed because things are moving from one link to another on a VPN. Very handy, and this information is all available. Now, you can see even more, again, CLI, you can go in and look at this. This type of information isn't available directly in the GUI. You'd have to click on one of the logs or the rules, depending on what you're doing, to be able to see this information. But there is feature parity when it comes to this. You do get the same information. Just some people love command line, or maybe they're using our full REST API as well. Being able to link into this and grab this information, really helpful when you're trying to troubleshoot. We saw at the beginning, this is the bottom portion of the SD-WAN, where you set up the interface and add the members. Remember, I showed you some of these links as well. So you're able to look at bandwidth, volume, and sessions just by clicking on something. It's very, very quick. Also, this is under the FortiView tab. So if you look at FortiView and then all sessions, the destination interface is a great way to look, because you can see what sessions are active right now and what destination interface are they using. So as they're egressing your network, you'll notice that the FEX, so that's the FortiExtender product. So imagine doing 3G, 4G, attaching that as another interface. You could do that. So if you want to have a SIM card, make that another egress point in your network from a WAN perspective, you could do that. You'll see there's traditional WAN 1, WAN 2, both MPLS, but you can see which sessions are going where. Now, the forward traffic from login report does the same thing. You can go in and look at this. Again, you can do it in the CLI using diag sniffer packet commands because, again, we want to offer you the traffic shaping. I touched on this earlier, but if you're using QoS with, being able to, using requeuing or anything like that, prioritization, you can actually do that on the FortiGate, and it still applies with your SD-WAN traffic. And you can do it per IP or shared for anybody who hasn't used this before. So, this is great granularity, especially when you're talking about voice and video. But you can define how you want things to work. You can see here the source destination, the services. There's a lot of options that you can go in and configure this for you. The difference is now you'll see the outgoing interface is SD-WAN instead of WAN 1 as an example. So this is actually a picture of our fabric. So if you have not heard of the security fabric and you're new to Fortinet, I'd just like to say that it is our ecosystem approach to security. And really what it's about is the broad visibility you can get across your entire environment. I talked earlier about how we do FortiWi-Fi, 40 APs, which, a wireless solution, or, as an example, FortiSwitch, our wired LAN solution. Being able to combine that and look on the fly what's going on in your environment, you'll see that there's a problem on the third WAN to internet and on port 1. Just by hovering over it, you can see the load balancing algorithm and the weights that are assigned. All this information is available to you. And this is just one quick little dashboard you can look at. There's tons of logs behind this and everything else, but at a bird's eye view, it's a great tool to determine if there's a problem early on. Now, we talked about secure SD-WAN and being able to have visibility. This is the map view. You'll notice towards the left side of the screen that there's very much like Google Maps or Apple Maps. Like you can actually see where your gateways are in the world. You kind of zoom in. It's really neat. But it's helpful because, like, I worked at a place before where we had these crazy host names where the first two characters were the country, and then, the city it was in, and the floor of the building it was on. There was a street address in there. It was insane. So 16 or 18 characters long, you'd look at these host names and it didn't even make sense. It'd make your head hurt looking at a whole bunch of them. And unless you dealt with the resource all the time, you couldn't remember where it was. So being able to look at this information will really help your support people. There's also a table view, and in the bottom right corner, this is not a very good screenshot. I talked about this morning, and I apologize for that. But that information is usually when you have SD-WAN member interfaces live, it's very dynamic. Like it'll show you, you can move your mouse around these graphs and see how each of your links is performing. Every one of your SLAs, there's granular packet loss latency and jitter counts. So you can see over a period of time, which you can define, last 24 hours, et cetera. You go pick what you want and it'll show you the performance of your links. So that will really, really make a difference when you're trying to troubleshoot some of this stuff. And you're going to get to see some of this stuff in your lab. So, please, by all means, dive in there and look. We talked about zero touch provisioning very quickly. Again, this is, one of those things that it is a quality of life piece. It's done through our FortiManager product. Again, you can do everything, on the FortiGate itself, but when you start having, hundreds, like I'm dealing with a customer that has over 400 retail, outlets, and trying to get in to deal with each one of those stores, it would be unreal. Can you imagine trying to log into all those? You just couldn't do it. So to have a centralized, management plane to be able to look at all these different things, and then have that zero touch provisioning. I used that example with the medical offices earlier. That's very applicable to a lot of industries. It doesn't really matter what vertical you're in. Just the fact that you can deploy these to other places without having to, have all the manpower there and employ staff that, maybe you just don't have a huge networking or security team. It's tough. It's really tough to do this. If you are a person that's interested in, anything like Ansible, Terraform, et cetera, we maintain a couple public GitHubs from Fortinet's perspective. We also have something called Fortinet Developer Network, or you'll hear us call it FNDN. You can get access to that. There's no cost. If you want to see that, if you're a Fortinet customer, we'd be more than happy to provide you access to look at the API, and you can start using it. That's all built into the product. There's no cost. So if you're looking at things like that, or you want to do some CLI scripting, it's a great place to go. Now, looking at the FortiManager itself, again, looking at all those things we saw earlier, all the logs, the measurements and the metrics that are available. We talked about the map, that was in here as well. So all your policy, everything gets done here, and you can, same thing with the FortiGate. If you started with the FortiGate and added the FortiManager later, you can import the existing configuration that you've already built for both your security policies and your SD-WAN as an example. bring it all into the FortiManager, clean it up, make it applicable for your entire environment, and then push it out to all your gateways. You can do that in the click of a button. It is great. So being able to send this out to hundreds or thousands of gateways, it just makes your life so much easier. Maintaining logs and things like that on the SLAs. There's a security rating service you can do as well. We use that for best practice configuration. It's really to catch human error. So as an example, if you didn't have, block botnet communication on one of your egress interfaces, you just forgot to do it, or maybe you turned it off by accident, it will catch things like that. Now, security rating service used to be only for enterprise or 360 level support packages, but now you'll see in the newer versions that there is a lot of security rating it's built in for free. It's just we recognize that it was something that we thought would be better for the average user populace. Now, there are some advanced features that you can pay for, and that can be added even if you had a UTM subscription, but just be aware that it's there. If you're not sure or you want to hear more information about that, just talk to your local team. One thing I'll mention at the very end here, the security fabric topology, you can still see that. So that some of those graphical pictures I showed you from the Fortigate itself, you can get all that, type of good information here, and it will really help you, again, from a centralized perspective, because you're not going to want to log into a million different boxes. It's just very, very time consuming. Here's another picture of our map, being able to look at things at a high level. You could see where your VPN tunnels are going, where your gateways are located. If they're having problems, they'll be different color. There's a lot of things you can do, and this is a really, really neat feature. So we're just about finished here. I'm just going to do just review a couple things that we talked about. Again, secure SD-WAN. That is our combination best of breed next generation FortiGate firewall upon which the company was built. Kenji, our founder and CEO, has worked really, really hard with some great people to design these products. And this is something that we want to be able to take some of these newer SD-WAN networking capabilities and integrate them. And that's where we came up with the term secure SD-WAN, because that's a differentiator. We were the pioneer of the pure play security vendors to be able to go in and say, hey, we're going to participate in this networking, like everybody else. And that we're actually being measured against those pure play SD-WAN vendors. That's why when you look at NSS Labs and things like that, like we take this stuff really seriously, and we want to make sure that the product is not only secure, but easy to use. And really, we want to make your quality of life better. So if that can happen, that's great. We talked a little bit about the ASICs earlier, the purpose-built security processors. Again, we design them in-house. We build them in-house. Everything's there. We design our software to work with those to get the most performance out of them as possible. We take that, combine it with the enhanced application awareness that we've talked about for numerous things, build that in with a WAN path controller with some quality of service, and add that to your SD-WAN. The security fabric itself, the ecosystem approach to security that I reviewed a few minutes ago, it's the same thing for an easy bird's eye view of your entire network, your entire security operation, to be able to look at this information and decide, is there a problem? Should I dive in deeper? You don't have to necessarily dive into hundreds of logs. You can start there and see if there's a problem. We can scale out very well with a FortiManager. And again, 360 Protections is our most comprehensive protection bundle that's offered. If it's something you're curious about, hey, what is 360? You can look on any of our data sheets that are available on Google. Just Google any one of our FortiGate appliances. They're there. You'll see a quick bulleted point list of what's the difference between the bundles. You get things like proactive, proactive configuration management. You get things like dedicated engineering resources, review. There's all sorts of things. But, that security rating service I talked about is built in, the advanced version of that. Again, there is probably documentation online as well about 360 and some of the protection levels, but if you're not sure, talk to your local team. Now, just for the last couple of minutes, I just want to review a couple of things that we felt were important to mention regarding the lab exercises. Again, if anybody would like to participate in the labs, off to the right of your screen, there is usually a control panel. You will see a raise hand icon. It's a picture of the palm of a hand, and you'll see a green arrow pointing up towards the base of the palm. Click that once. The arrow will turn orange and point down. That's okay. That means that your hand is up. One of our staff will send you an email to give you information to log into the CloudShare platform to participate in the lab exercises. It could take up to 2 hours. It's up to you. It depends on your level of comfort and expertise, but there's no charge to do it. And I really recommend doing it because it is the best part of this entire session. Now, looking at the lab diagram, this is in your information. If you want to take a quick screenshot while we're talking, go ahead. I made it nice and big so people can look at it. I just want you to know that this information is there. So you're going to get your chance to do configuration from the Fortigate and the FortiManager for SD-WAN, and it'll take you through the whole thing. Now, looking at the class environments, please log in with the email that was used to register for this event. I realized afterwards I was talking to our Canadian field marketing manager, and she was just letting me know that these accounts are pre-created, and that way, so you're not using some crazy thing, some email that you've made up. This one is a Yahoo for an example, but it was Chris Pratico, who is the leader of our technology branch that designed for training. So he actually make an appearance. He made an appearance on the morning call. So just a great guy, really understands these environments, and he's dedicated to making this experience as good as possible for you. You'll notice that there is a passphrase that will be provided to you by your instructor. Again, you will get an email with information. If you don't get one, make a note in the chat, and we will get back to you immediately. When you log in to the CloudShare platform, again, this isn't Fortinet, this is CloudShare. A lot of vendors will use platforms like this to teach labs and be able to test things virtually. The one thing I want you to realize that there's a few things that you can do to make your life a little bit better. Now, you'll notice at the top, there are tabs. So you'll see Overview, Fortified Lab Guide. Every time you open a virtual machine, it'll appear on the top here. The lab guide itself is what I was, actually you'll get to see a picture of that in a moment, but that's the interactive guide that takes you through all your tasks and it validates your results. There are some questions and you get to answer them based on the information that's there, but that's where that's all done. Now, when you actually do the tasks, like you have to go in and it says log into the FortiManager, et cetera, you're using the web browser on the jump box. Think of the jump box as your platform to connect to all the different resources. The lab guide is just, imagine having a separate book there telling you what to do. That's your textbook. The jump box server is your canvas. Paint your picture. So the full screen button, you'll see in the middle, off to the left under connection display. If you click on that, it'll basically enlarge what you have now. So you'll see it'll change to something like this. You'll notice in the top left portion of the picture there, the recycle bin, you'll see there's an inverted triangle. If you click on that, it'll drop down the menu. It'll tell you can exit full screen mode, etc. If you're doing this on a laptop with a 13 or 14-inch screen, this may be best for you. But there's another way to do it as well. So when we start to look at that, I'll talk about that in just a minute. So when you log in, enter your name. It makes it a lot easier for us to kind of deal with this after the fact. There is an application banner across the top. You'll see there's a score in the top right corner. Don't worry about the score. Originally, the Fast Track program was created for our partners, and it was meant as, they can have some friendly competition between the engineering staff there to see, who actually paid attention, who actually grasps these concepts better. And it's fun, but it's not the intent of what we're trying to do today. So don't worry. If you have to ask for a hint, which I'll talk about in a minute, it's okay. It might deduct a couple points. It doesn't matter. We're not looking at it. If you're working with some colleagues and you want to have bragging rights, that's up to you, but don't feel it's necessary. Objectives list. This is where you're going to see what you're supposed to do. You'll notice that there are 4 tasks. You'll see 1.0 up to 4.0. And this is for a different lab. This is for FortiManager and FortiAnalyzer. But the first one just kind of guides you through to teach you what are you looking at. And then the next two are 2.0 and 3.0 are your 2 choices. Now, important to know, for us, it'll be Fortigate first and FortiManager second. The Fortigate, once you pick whatever one you want to do. So you could start with FortiManager if you want, but most people start at Fortigate. That's what I'd recommend, especially if you're new to the product line. If you've never done this before, definitely start with the Fortigate. But when you do that, as you click through, you start a section. There's scripts that run behind the scenes and make changes for you to the environment. You need to stay with it. So if you pick Fortigate and then you went, oh, actually, I want to do FortiManager, it's too late. Once you've picked one, you have to see it through to completion, then you can do the other one. So that's important to note. The blue bubble, you'll see the green bubbles are steps that you've completed. The blue bubble shows you where you are right now. Now, as we move down, you'll see there's display tabs, see description, there's hint 1, etc. One of the things that I've noticed is some people say to me, let's back up for a second. Historically, what we used to do, we give you a list of 10 steps. Step 1, click here. Step 2, do this. The problem is that people said at the very end of it, okay, it was good training, but I didn't feel challenged. I want to feel challenged. So we had to come up with a way. How do we do that without making it really difficult for new people? And I understand some of you are probably new to the product line. So you'll see that the description, when you look at this here, it's all rich text. So there's going to be information inside that's going to have pictures. It's going to have, bold font, etc., colored font. It's important because we want to make it easy to read, but at the same time, we don't want to make it too difficult. If you have to ask for a hint, you'll notice in the bottom left corner, just above the ready button, you'll see it says request hint. It's actually not very clear because it looks like the font is gray. But in this screenshot, don't be afraid to ask for a hint. The hint will point you in the right direction. If you still don't understand, click request hint again. It will give you that step 1 to 10 that I talked about. It gives you your recipe. If you follow the recipe at the end, you get your cake. So don't be afraid to do that. Please, if you're new, click the hint button and learn, because we want this to be fun. There's nothing worse than feeling like you're in university again, looking at an exam that you have no idea because you didn't read that book. So try to enjoy this. Do what you can. There's an answer choice at the bottom. If you get it wrong, that's okay. It might take away a point. It doesn't matter. You'll learn from the experience. And this is something that at the end of the day, as long as you've done what's at the top, you should get all the information you need. The continue button is what you press when you think that you've selected the correct answer. And then you'll notice at the very bottom, there's a status bar with the ready. If you make a mistake, it will tell you made a mistake. And I would advise anybody who is experienced with Fortinet, please read the questions, because I promise there are things in there. It's not meant to be tricky, but it tells you to do something. And a lot of us, when we have that synaptic pathway in our brain that says, oh, I know how to do this, you won't read the instructions. You'll just click through and you think that you get it right, and you might make a mistake. So again, it doesn't matter, but just to make things fun and keep them moving, that's what I would do. There's a scale text slider in the top right corner. If you are visually impaired, or you just find the font is too small and you've got a headache today, change that. You can scroll in your browser and zoom in your browser, but you can adjust the scale text here as well. And then you can finally resize these bars. If you want to drag them up or down, if you've got a monster monitor in front of you, 32-inch or one of these ultra wide screens, go nuts. Scale it out, do what you have to do, make life fun. Now, we talked about adjusting the view a little bit. We talked about scaling and things like that. But one of the things I'd recommend you do, especially if you have a bigger monitor, right-click on your browser tab at the top. You'll see where it says Cloud Share on this particular example. Choose Duplicate. It will then give you another tab that you could tear off and put side by side with something else. So now your screen will look like this. This makes a huge difference. Now you'll notice actually at the bottom, right where the woman's legs start to go digital, you'll see there's a little arrow pointing to the left inside a circle. If you click that, that will take all that gray information and it'll shrink it. It'll minimize it. So you can still pull it back out. It's very similar to Adobe if you're used to their control panel that they put on their reader on the right side. It's colorful, and I don't know, it just takes a huge chunk of my screen sometimes. So I like to shrink that down. You can pop it out if you need to, but just be aware there's a lot of things you can do to make this cleaner. You can use browser zoom. So if you want to use browser zoom, basically go in and start to make these bigger or smaller depending on how you want to do. But yeah, so you're almost done. You can look at these things, put it on a second. If you don't want to put them side by side, if you've got two monitors, that's even better. Drag it to the other monitor and have it there with your Spotify or whatever you're using to listen to music, and enjoy the session. It's not going to affect anything. We just want to make sure you can see things. Very final thing I want to mention here. This is important. So anybody who's used to Fortinet, you know about the IPsec VPN wizard. You've probably used it. You probably like it. Don't use it in this exercise, please, because unless you really advanced user and don't go in and use the wizard like you'd use the custom tab, etc., you're going to create all those policies, the default routes, all that stuff. You're going to have to go and delete it all. And I promise it'll waste about 15 minutes of your life. Don't do it. When it tells you to create a VPN interface inside the member, do what it shows on this screenshot. You'll notice that there's the plus VPN button that appears. You don't see it until you're in the interface. So when you go to add the interface, you click the drop-down box, you'll notice that the plus VPN will appear there. Then put the information in that's in the lab guide, It does tell you this in the instructions, but I can tell you if I had to pick one thing across all the classes I've ever seen for this technology, this is the one that people who are experienced will do wrong. And in a classroom environment, it's even worse because people who don't know look at the person who supposedly does know and they all copy them. I've seen this happen where whole rows of people have followed along with someone that did it wrong, and then they have to go and delete it all. So don't do that. I'm going to click through the animation because I just copied this slide before the presentation just so you would be aware. This is what I'm talking about. So if you see, this is just a quick screenshot I took from one of my lab boxes. Under VPN tab, there's an IPsec wizard. It looks very similar. Please don't use this. We want you to use this one. With that said, I don't think there was anything else that we want to talk about. I'm not sure. I think that's everything. Folks on the panel, if you have anything you'd like to add, please let me know. Otherwise, everybody, please enjoy your sessions. Really appreciate your time today. Thank you.